I am very happy to welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Josh Rovner. I'm the Director of Youth Justice with the Sentencing Project. And I'm very thankful to you, and I'm very thankful to our panel of experts who's going to be joining us today. The Sentencing Project advocates for effective and humane responses to crime that minimize imprisonment and criminalization of youth and adults by promoting racial, ethnic, and gender justice, as well as economic justice. That's very much in line with the topic we're going to talk about today, which is America's growing movement to divert youth out of the justice system. It's been a topic that's been of great interest to our team, our youth justice team at the Sentencing Project for the past couple of years. And we'll be talking for the next hour about what it means to divert youth to effective community-based responses that support their success rather than arresting them or involving a young person formally in the court system. Before we get started with the program, please know that I've saved the last piece of this hour for your questions. If you have questions, please make sure that you use the Q&A box. I can already see that our chat box is very busy, and we really don't monitor the chat box so much. So your questions, please make sure that you use the Q&A box. Our most common question is whether this will be recorded. It will. For everyone who registered for this, you'll be getting a recording shortly. And we also post it on our YouTube page for safekeeping, I suppose. Let me introduce our panel of experts who have firsthand experience in diversion, as well as an excellent advocate who helped guide a needed reform through his state's legislature that's going to result in more kids receiving these kinds of services. So let me start by having our panelists introduce themselves. How about Jessica, then Jason, then Richard?
Hello, my name is Jessica Ellis, Executive Director of Sentinel Youth Services in the Los Angeles area.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jason Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of the Michigan Center for Youth Justice.
Hi, I'm Dick Mendel. I'm the Senior Research Fellow for Youth Justice at the Sentencing Project, and I've been writing the diversion reports recently. Back to you, Josh.
Thanks so much. So you'll be hearing from the three of them later in the hour. Can I ask the three of you to turn off your cameras now? And we'll see you in no time at all. So I'm really happy to introduce Jay, who lives and works and goes to school in Philadelphia. He's actually taking time off work to join us today to talk about his experiences. I've said this to Jay myself. It's really not easy to talk about your life experiences in these way in a audience like this one to a bunch of strangers, and I appreciate his willingness to do so. You know, Jay, you've told me about the night you were arrested for stealing a car, how you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, but we're really here to talk about what happened after that and how you're doing today. You know, car theft is an offense that can and does result in serious jail and prison time. But instead of going to court, you were diverted to a community-based program, Youth Art and Self-Empowerment Projects Healing Futures. And for the audience, when you hear us talking about YASP, that's the acronym for Youth Art and Self-Empowerment Project. So, Jay, why don't you tell us a little bit about what it was like when you first got to YASP and met with the program's co-directors?
Yes, I was a little, I didn't feel like I had to be there just because of the mindset that I was in already at the moment. But once I met Felix and Queen from the YASP program, they opened up to me immediately, and my mom. And they made me feel comfortable to open up about everything I've been through, everything I've done on and off the record. And they were just very helpful in opening my mind and expanding my imagination into new things.
That's great. By the way, could you lower your camera a little bit? We're sort of like cutting off at your chin. Much better. So you had mentioned Felix and Queen. Can you tell the audience who they are?
Queen is the host that were watching over me. Well, not watching over, that was running the program for me and the other defendant I was with.
Okay. And so you met them for the first time. How did you feel about them, and how did they make you feel?
Automatically came up to me and gave me a hug and said she introduced herself nicely, and as well to my mom too. And Felix came up to me in a respectful way, shook my hand, say, "Nice to meet you. We're gonna be together a lot, so might as well get comfortable now."
Is that what you expected it was going to be like?
I didn't think they were gonna be that nice, to be honest, not at all. Like I just thought it was, they were just there to tell you what you did was wrong and just don't do it again.
Okay, so I understand the first several weeks of the program were spent thinking about and preparing for a meeting with the woman whose car was stolen. And so my first question is, how long did all of this last? How long did the whole program last?
Program lasted about, I'm gonna say 4 months in total.
Okay, and preparing for the meeting with the woman?
Preparing for the meeting took the like 7 weeks.
Okay, so why don't you tell us what it was like to prepare for that meeting? Had you thought about the car owner before on the night you got caught in her car?
At that moment when I was in her car, I already knew like I was selfish of myself because anybody can ask me a question, would you want your car stolen? I'm gonna say no every time. It's just common sense. So I was really selfish when I got in the car. But once they told me that we was gonna get a chance to meet her and apologize and read out loud to her, it made me like less stressful. Like I felt like I was gonna get a chance to redeem myself.
Take a look here. So after preparing for that meeting, you actually met with her. What was that like for you?
It was nice. We actually all met in like my neighborhood. I didn't expect it was gonna be around me, but it was around my neighborhood. We went to a building. We all sat in a circle and we had a ball. Whoever had a ball got to speak, and everybody else had to listen. So we all took turns to speak on what we did, why we did it, what we like should have been doing, and they even gave her a chance for our mothers to speak too.
So that's an important thing that you're bringing up of who else was in the room with you. So when you say we had a meeting, who was there? How many people and what were they there for?
It was me, the defendant, my mother, his mother, my sister, Queen and Felix, and Mike, and the lady's car we took.
Hmm. How are you feeling going into that meeting, into that restorative justice circle?
I was nervous, even though we wrote it all down on paper and we got to practice it many times, keeping the eyes on her, speaking loud. I was still nervous to read because I didn't want to, mess it up in front of her because it's an apology that matters.
So how did it go? What was the meeting like when it actually started?
It went good though, like she even said that I like that you talked to me calmly and I like that was respectful about it. And she just forgave me. And I was glad that she got to forgive me.
How'd that make you feel when you got forgiveness?
It made me more, it made me less like self-absorbed, like other people matter. I'm not the only one that's in this world. Everybody goes through things, and I'm glad that she got to see past all of that. I was really grateful.
That's nice. So after the restorative justice meeting, though, you were still involved in YASP. You volunteered at a local community garden. You spent a lot of time talking with a community member who helped to oversee the garden. Can you tell me a little bit about what that was like?
Yeah, that was Mike from Iglesias Garden. He was actually like super welcoming too, because he related a little bit more. He was from my neighborhood, like from my neighborhood. He knows a lot of people that I know out there, and he wasn't so quick to say, "Oh, why I do this and why I did this." He was more quick to say it as what happened before that. What made you feel like you had to go out and do that? And that just felt like he was really understanding from the beginning.
Yeah. Are you still in touch with Mike?
Yeah, I literally just seen him 2 days ago on my way here. Like we work around the same place, and he lives around me, so I
Oh,
see him.
that's great. But you're done with the program, right? So this is
Yeah,
totally
done
on
with the
choice.
program. Yeah.
And how about Felix and Queen at YASP? Are you still in touch with them too?
Actually, yeah, I just went to the office like a week ago to see them, and Queen just texted me as soon as I joined it. She said, "Hope you do good," and I'm so proud of you.
That's great. So I was talking with Felix preparing for this too, and he really is. He just thinks the world of you, which was very cool to hear. I mean, anytime that you're putting together a panel like this one, you hope that the participants are going to be good, and he just couldn't stop saying good things about you. So can't, I just want to let you know that too. So if you take a step back and where you are in your life and how things have changed since you participated in the diversion program, can you tell us a little bit about how you're doing now?
Honestly, everything changed. Before I walked in that building, like I wasn't doing good in school. I was outside every single day. I did get in trouble, like at places like where like they'll call the cops, but they want to arrest you. They'll like call your parents to come and get you. Like I was getting in trouble at stores, and my mom had come and get me a couple of times. Kept on fighting a lot, but once I got to once I got to Yas, I already knew that I can't mess up again. Can't even get locked up again at all. But for like Yas opened my mind up to like new things. Like I don't have to be outside every day. And they're actually the ones that encouraged me to get a job and start actually saving up, you know, to help because they knew the situation I was in, living in my grandma's house with my mom. So they helped me get a job, they helped me save up. So focus on new things.
This is just wonderful to hear. I did want to ask you though, like, how's school going for you?
Well, as you guys know, a couple days ago, I was in the meeting with my teachers, got all my grades up. So my grades are actually like all B's and like two C's. And I used to be like straight D's. I used to like pass with D's, but now I'm doing good and I'm going to senior year.
That's awesome. So you're gonna have to get back to work at 12:30. So I have one last question for you. I'm then gonna look at the questions that got sent in via the Q&A before giving it on to Dick. But the last question that I have that I want to ask you is, would you say that your experience with YASP helped you turn a corner?
Yeah, I would say it definitely made me realize there's more to just getting in trouble every day. There's more of a life to live if you can make a difference.
So is it, I mean, when you say getting in trouble every day, like there was the thing that you got arrested for, but there was other problems that you were causing.
Just me being outside with my friends, thinking it was cool, not
Yeah.
being home with my mom, not none of that.
Yeah. I'm really happy to hear you're doing so well. It was kind of cool every time that we were trying to do a practice session and you were like, actually, I got to go to work today. Like what an awesome answer that was and that we could make this work. So I do see a question, someone asking me what YASP stands for. I have that right. Youth Arts and Self-Empowerment Project. Okay. And let's see, we have some congratulations, some people saying what an inspiration you are. Oh, here's a good question. To what extent did your shift in thinking happen because of others who believe in you or your own internal resilience?
One more time.
Someone's asking like how much it mattered, the support that you got, like from your mentors because of people who believed in you or your family members who believed in you, and how much of it was sort of internal in believing in yourself.
I'm not gonna lie. I don't want to say like I had to have somebody telling me they're proud of me just to make me feel like I'm doing something, but it definitely helped 10 times way more hearing every time I seen Felix and Queen saying how proud of me they are, how they see me changing, how they like how I'm cooperating and I'm being respectful. Like I like that they kept me going, making sure that I knew myself that I was doing good.
Excellent. Well, listen, thank you so much for your time. I hope you can stick around for like another 15 minutes before going back to work. If you want to turn off your camera now, you can. And I'll introduce my colleague, Dick Mendel, who is a senior research fellow with Sentencing Project. And Dick, if you want to share your screen, you can present your slides. Jay, you're going to want to turn off your camera for a little while. And I will do the same. Dick, it's all yours.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Josh. Thanks to all of you for coming.
One second. I'm not sure we're seeing your slides.
Oh, I thought I put it on. Sorry. Is that great?
Yes, we can see them now.
Okay, great. I'm really excited that all of you have come and that so many of you have come. As Josh said, there's like more than 1,000 people signed up, and I'm thrilled because this webinar is about diversion, which until recently has really been a back burner issue in youth justice. It just hasn't gotten a lot of high-level policy attention. It hasn't been in the news. It's mostly been an afterthought in youth justice, and it really shouldn't be. More and more, the research is making clear that expanding and improving diversion and reducing or hopefully eliminating disparities in diversion really has to be a top priority for reform if we ever want to create a youth justice system that's fair and effective, that keeps communities safe, and that guides young people to success. Trying to advance my, there we are. Today, I want to tell you about 6 lessons and then ask a question. The first is that the research is making first lesson is more and more clear that the involvement in the justice system is toxic for youth. The courts just don't seem to have what it takes to steer teens towards a positive and law-abiding future, and it doesn't seem like an effective venue for improving behavioral health and reversing delinquent conduct. The second lesson is that in light of that research, diversion is vastly underutilized in the United States. The third is that diversion is a point of deep, pervasive, and highly consequential disparities, that the unequal treatment at the diversion phase of the court process plays a pivotal role in perpetuating the justice system's vast racial and ethnic disparities in confinement for youth. The fourth is that many common policies and practices employed for diversion unnecessarily exacerbate disparities and limit diversion opportunities. A lot of our practices really don't make any sense on diversion. The fifth is that there are many constructive reforms available to address these problematic practices, expand the use of diversion, and reduce disparities. And the sixth, as documented in my latest report, there's a small but growing and encouraging national movement to expand and improve diversion. We want to grow that movement. Together, the 6 questions point to the question of what we can do and how we can, as a field, push diversion to the top of the agenda in youth justice reform. So I'm going to talk about each of these lessons in turn, but let's start by defining our terms. When I use the word diversion, what exactly am I talking about? So diversion is really a fuzzy term in juvenile justice and youth justice speak. We use it to describe virtually any decision, any time that allows a young person to avoid a deeper level of penetration into the justice system. That can include deferred prosecution or consent decrees rather than adjudication once kids are in court, probation instead of placement or confinement, specialty courts instead of standard probation. It can also be used to describe programs or agreements that youth might be required to follow to avoid prosecution in court. But for my purposes today, and in the recent reports I've been writing, we talk about diversion only as a decision to address delinquent conduct without involving a young person formally in the court system. More specifically, diversion can be pre-arrest diversion, where a decision is made not to arrest a young person for alleged law breaking, or it can be pre-court diversion, which is informal processing of cases referred to juvenile court following arrest. So now let's get to our lessons. The first one is that involvement in the justice system is toxic for youth. And I hope that none of the system people in the webinar here take offense at those strong words, but the evidence is overwhelming that despite our best intentions, involvement in the justice system does more harm than good with most young people, and that diversion is the superior option for most youth accused of law breaking. The single most ambitious, detailed, and carefully controlled study on this question, it was called the Crossroads Study, was completed in 2020. The study involved more than 1,000 young people in 3 jurisdictions, all of them arrested for moderately serious offenses that were on the edge of what judges usually considered for diversion. And the scholars tracked these young people, diverted or not diverted, over several years and measured their progress on 19 outcomes. And the score for the kids who were formally processed in court, who weren't diverted, was 0 for 19. The youth processed in court were more likely to be rearrested, more likely to drop out of school, more likely to commit violence, and have several other negative outcomes. They didn't do better on anything. And this wasn't an outlier. It mirrors the findings of many previous studies, a whole body of research. 2 meta-analyses examined the full body of experimental evidence and found that formal processing leads to much more future involvement in the justice system. We also have research showing that arrests in adolescence have a damaging effect on young people's futures. Compared to comparable kids who engage in similar delinquent conduct, those who get arrested are more likely to drop out of school, less likely to attend and succeed in college, and they have substantially lower incomes at age 30. There's also substantial evidence that diverting kids before arrest, that's pre-arrest diversion, yields even better outcomes in informal processing and diversion after an arrest when the court decides not to formally prosecute kids. So on to lesson number 2, diversion is vastly underutilized. Here, this slide shows the share of cases that are diverted nationwide, and you can see that it just doesn't change for a generation now. Every year, between 43 and 47% of the kids referred to court on delinquency charges get diverted. More than half every year get prosecuted. And you can see in this slide, that makes us an outlier among nations, and not in a good way. These other countries have seen the evidence, they've heard the evidence, and they started diverting more and more of their young people away from court. 75%, 80%, 83% of them now diverted from court, not put into the court system. We've been had our head in the sand. We're not improving on this at all so far, and that's too bad. Let's get to lesson number 3. Diversion is a point of deep and pervasive disparities with highly consequential disparities. Here you can see overall the share of cases by race and ethnicity that get diverted. 52% of white kids get diverted, but only 40% of Black kids get diverted, and somewhere in between for other races and ethnicities. And this disparity is getting worse rather than better. In 2005, white kids were 20% more likely to be diverted than Black kids. In 2021, that had grown to 31%. And it's not a function of kids' behavior. Here on this slide, you can see on the left is the overall share of cases diverted. Again, 52% of white kids to get diverted, but only 40% of Black kids. But then you break it down by within different offense categories: violent crimes, property crimes, public order crimes, drug offenses. Within each crime category, white kids are much more likely to be diverted, Black kids much more likely to be prosecuted. And in this slide, we talk about that there's that many controlled research studies find that kids of color are less likely to be diverted even after controlling for their current offense, offending history, and other variables. At least 20 studies have documented disparate treatment at this phase of the process. And they also found compelling research showing that disparities at diversion have cascading effects, that earlier involvement in the justice system because of lack of diversion opportunities for youth of color greatly increases their likelihood that they'll be arrested for any subsequent misconduct and intensifies the severity of punishments they receive later in the process because they've accumulated these court histories. Now let's go to lesson number 4. Many common policies and practices employed in diversion unnecessarily exacerbate disparities and limit diversion opportunities. So in my research, I asked the question, what's causing all of these disparities in diversion? And I identified 2 main factors. And the first is subjectivity and implicit bias. The states have exhibited a crippling lack of leadership on diversion. You can see here in most states, most of the time, there have been no clear rules or policy guidance for who gets diverted and who doesn't. There's no detailed data collected on diversion. There's little or no effort to analyze diversion data by race and ethnicity, and no explicit goals to expand the use of diversion or to reduce disparities. Instead, most cases, most of the time, decisions are made on the fly. The process is idiosyncratic and subjective. And we know that whenever subjectivity is allowed to rule in the justice system, in juvenile justice or anywhere, disparities and bias are soon to follow. The other factor driving disparities is a slew of widespread but misguided policies and practices that seem objective in theory, but harm youth of color disproportionately in practice. There's limiting the eligibility for diversion to first-time offenders or for kids who've committed only misdemeanors or sometimes only status offenses. It's the long-time practice in much of the country, and it has enormous impact on racial equity because of the much higher arrest rates for youth of color, but it has no basis in research. Other problematic practices are employing passive or ineffective methods to inform youth and families and invite them into diversion programs so that they end up missing out, imposing rules and requirements that make it difficult for parents and families to participate in diversion by scheduling or requiring attendance at meetings at inconvenient times and locations, for instance. There's requiring youth to admit guilt as a condition to be invited to diversion. There's charging fees for youth and families to participate in diversion. They're structuring diversion like probation with rules and conditions with the threat of prosecution for noncompliance with rules. And they're sending youth back to court for failing to comply with diversion rules and requirements. So the evidence is overwhelming that our youth justice systems are missing the mark badly right now on diversion. We aren't diverting nearly enough young people. We have enormous and enormously important disparities in diversion, and we're employing many problematic practices for diversion with no evidence behind them. And that's the bad news. But fortunately, there's also a lot of good news to talk about. There really are reasons, 2 very good reasons to be optimistic right now about youth diversion. And the first is that many constructive reform steps are available to address all of the problematic policies and practices I've described. Second is that even more encouraging is, as I document in this new report, Protect and Redirect, there's a small but encouraging national movement emerging to expand and improve diversion. Specifically, the report documents promising reform steps taken in 23 states and 8 localities over the past 5 to 10 years. And that's just a sampling of what's been done. And these reforms can be grouped into 4 categories. There's new laws, programs, and pathways to expand the use of diversion. There's new initiatives to combat disparities in diversion. There's embracing best practices to improve outcomes for youth who get diverted. And then there's using data to build support for an increased success in diversion once kids are diverted. Now, in terms of expanding the use of diversion, several states and local justice systems have enacted new policies and programs to expand diversion, to mandate diversion in many cases or make it the default option, to provide state funding to support diversion programming, to keep youth with significant human services needs out of the justice system rather than requiring them to be court involved in order to access the services that they need. There's expanding the use of pre-arrest diversion. We're going to hear more about that from Jessica in a few minutes. And there's raising the minimum age for juvenile court, which means automatic diversion for younger youth. That's been the 15 states have, or 16 have raised the minimum age just in the last decade or so. And you can see, sorry. You can see in this slide that these initiatives can have, and these reforms can have a big impact here in Utah. You can see that over the last decade or so that they've, less than a decade, they've doubled the share of cases that get diverted. Now, in a few states and localities, and not nearly enough, have begun to explicitly target disparities in diversion as a key focus. In New York and Pennsylvania, for instance, teams from multiple counties have come together to do intensive analysis, strategic planning, and action to identify and address disparities in diversion. I think I'm running behind on time, so I'm going to skip through. There's lots and lots of examples available in the papers that I've that I've published. But you can, here you go. You can see the this is the page where you can find all of our diversion efforts. But the evidence is overwhelming that youth justice systems are missing the mark badly on diversion. We aren't diverting nearly enough youth. We are employing many problematic practices for diversion. My notes are messed up here. But let me step back now and try to just frame the challenge for you, what we have going forward, and lead up to my question. Here are the findings from a brand new follow-up paper from the Crossroads study, hot off the presses. After tracking these young people for 9 years now, the scholars have found that the diversion decision, the decision whether or not kids are formally prosecuted or diverted at their first offense, was a life-changing event. Even after controlling for all kinds of background variables, the diverted kids were much more likely to desist from offending in both the short and the long term, and the kids prosecuted in court were much more likely to become persistent criminals. Diversion is, quote, as according to the study, quote, a critical desistant point in youth's lives. All of this leads up to my question. Now that we have the research showing that diversion is so pivotal, how can we make expanding and improving diversion and reducing disparities in diversion a top priority for youth justice reform? Here again is the page where you can find out more about this. I'm going to turn back to Josh now, and thank you for your time.
Thanks so much. You know, I really appreciate that presentation, and I hope that our audience understands just the depth of the research that went into this. There's 2 quite long papers, both of which you put up the QR code on those things. And the first one is really very much the case for diversion. And the second is the successful models that we learned about over the course of the next year, having already talked about it. So like I saw one of the questions in the chat is someone asking about what programs exist in their jurisdiction. I think that our report is a great place to go and find that. And if there isn't one, by all means, like notice that there's one in a nearby state or nearby community. I do see a couple of people in the audience who've been raising their hands. We prefer not to unmute people for that purpose. So if you have questions, please use the Q&A box instead. That is how we will get to your questions. Right now, I'd like to turn it over to Jessica Ellis, who's going to talk about her program in Los Angeles. And I will, if you'll just share your screen, I will turn off my own camera. Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm with Sentinel Youth Services, and we've specialized in diversion for 50 years now in the dense metro areas in and around Los Angeles, where youth of color are disproportionately impacted by the justice system. In 2011, with support from the Every Child Foundation, we partnered with the Los Angeles Police Department to pilot pre-booking or pre-arrest diversion, and we established the Every Child Restorative Justice Center. So now with 13 years of data from diverting over 5,000 youth from 11 LAPD stations, 4 Los Angeles County Sheriff stations, and 6 other urban police departments in the metro area, we have strong data showing that the earlier we divert and minimize contact with the system, the better the outcomes are for youth and for community safety. And we can do this in a way that still honors the needs of crime victims. In addition to diversion, we move upstream to provide training and prevention services to entities that overutilize police in response to youth behavior. And this has led to a 95% reduction in school-based arrests in 3 of our local school districts. So I'm going to get into first how we define diversion. At Sentinel Youth Services, we define it as interrupting the next legal step a case otherwise would have taken. So if it can be handled through counsel and release, it should not be in diversion. Diversion is for, in our definition, significant misdemeanor offenses and nonviolent felonies that would otherwise qualify for arrest and charging. This is how we protect against net widening. And at this point, we've more or less effectively achieved decriminalization of status offenses in our jurisdiction, status offenses being like curfew tickets and truancy. So we don't even count those under diversion. Defining diversion in our pre-booking, pre-arrest model, we are currently serving youth under 18 at the time of the offense. They can be turning 18 the very next day is fine. We hope to be able to expand that range up to 24. We're just working on some legal changes at the state level right now that are looking promising. And generally, the kids in our diversion program do not have a prior felony conviction. There are some exceptions to that, but it's not limited to first-time offenses only. And we'll get to a second, the wide variety of offenses that we take must be voluntary, not ordered. And when we do this at the pre-arrest level, that means we're working to rewrite law enforcement's arrest procedures. And so the kids will not get a booking number. They will not be put in the statewide database of arrests. There will be no fingerprints and no mugshot. We also do divert later from the system, pre-filing, but at this point, the bulk of our work is pre-booking because that's where we see even better outcomes. Here's a sampling of the offenses that are covered in this program. In bold are the felonies that are eligible for our diversion program. So we really can push the envelope beyond what so many diversion programs are limited to first-time offenses of very minor things like petty theft. We're showing with decades of data now that we can do this much more broadly. In this diversion program, the police still complete the crime report and complete their witness statements. Essentially, the arrest is ready to file, but put on hold. Youth are then released to a parent who signs off on an agreement to participate in diversion with some special protections for youth in foster care to make sure that they are given these opportunities. And then the referral and the crime report are sent electronically to our agency, and we start outreach to enroll in services. There is no police transporting of kids to our program, again, limiting contact with the system. And then when youth complete services, they can legally say they were not arrested. If they fail services, we have found most of our law enforcement partners do not follow through on, they can follow through on filing at that point. Many don't with the misdemeanors, and that's consistent with the research of often we're better doing nothing on an early misdemeanor or low-level offenses than putting kids in the system. And then if it is a more serious felony, then we can still file at that point. Our services include Restorative justice is the most important thing that we do. You heard Jay talk about his experience with that. That really, restorative justice is the secret sauce to really effective diversion. It builds empathy, it brings healing to both sides, both the responsible youth and the harm party. And so we bring them together. Another key part of our program is appropriate dosage. So we do a needs and risk assessment. The vast majority of kids that come in contact with police are at low risk of recidivism. So we want the lightest touch possible in diversion. You can actually overservice kids in diversion and increase their chances of recidivism. So the vast majority of our kids do restorative justice, make things right with those that they've impacted, and that's it, they're done. If there are much higher needs, then this is an example of the array of other potential services that we can do that are all individualized to the unique needs of the child. There's no other barriers to the family. We work around their schedule. We work around transportation needs. There are no fines and fees of any kind in our program. It's important. One of the great benefits of having a community-based organization lead diversion work as opposed to the system is we can be neutral. We're not an arm of law enforcement in the courts. So young people can admit to us if they're still struggling with continued drug use or gang involvement without the fear of piled on consequences. And when they can be more honest, we can be more effective in helping scaffold what they need to get to a point of wellness and success. We're also not creating an adversarial process between the harm party and the responsible youth. Through restorative justice, we can achieve real healing for both sides. And we've seen some incredible stories of reconciliation between folks who never thought they would speak to each other again because of the crime. And it's also really important that we have equity protections in this process. And there's some examples on the screen. Don't have quite enough time to get into all that. So a quick review of our outcomes, looking at data from LA County. When our kids are confined, we're seeing over 66 to 70% recidivism rates. When kids are receiving our justice system-led diversion, like informal probation, recidivism rates are about 33%. Versus kids in our program, we're seeing 8 to 11% recidivism rates. And that includes kids with felonies. We have found that even kids who completely failed our program had lower recidivism rates than kids going through the system. That means you lose nothing by trying diversion. When our kids are making things right with the harmed party, because empathy is built, the harm party asks for a lot less money than our system does when they pile on fines and fees on top of restitution. But when our kids agree to pay money back, they pay it, versus we found that in our system, it has a very high rate of assessing fines and fees on families and a low rate of collecting. So our kids are much more likely to complete restitution and community service if that's part of their agreement. And 86% of agreements with harm parties are completed in full. And we see 98% of the harm party or the crime victim reporting satisfaction with the process. And from the kids, 96% of them reporting that they felt that process was fair and equitable, which is huge. And huge cost differences as well. This is much more efficient for taxpayer dollars. So the key components is our kids can now have a clean background for their future, that we do assessment for right dosage levels and really lightest touch possible, individualized service plans. We're rooted in youth development and include equity protections and protections around net widening as part of the process. Thank you.
You know, that was really fabulous. And I really like on these webinars, having people who are able to talk on the ground of their experience of proving what the research that Dick has already shown happens community by community. And it's great that you're able to collect that data and show it, the cost effectiveness. It's wonderful. I'd love to turn to Jason Smith now. Jason will talk about his experiences in Michigan, because he really shepherded an awful good reform that made it through the Michigan legislature. And I think that that's an important piece of this, because in many cases, we really need better laws to implement these policies. So Jessica, why don't you turn your camera off? I'll do the same. And Jason, you can talk for about 10 minutes. We'll then open up the Q&A. Answering something I'm seeing a lot. We are sharing the recording, and we'll be sharing the slides that you saw with everyone who registered. So Jason, why don't you take it from here?
Thanks a lot, Josh, and thank you everybody for allowing me to present on the good work that's happening here in Michigan. I do want to share that it was definitely a team effort, both the entire team here at MCYJ, but also just a huge amount of stakeholders that were involved with passing some really significant reforms that will improve the lives of young people who come in contact with the justice system over a range of issues. So I am going to, in the chat, I don't have a PowerPoint, but I am going to share a couple of links with you all. The first one is the final report from the governor's task force here in Michigan on juvenile justice reform. So a couple of years ago, Governor Whitmer established a task force looking at a range of topics in the juvenile justice system. Really is the first time in, definitely my working career here in Michigan, but I mean, from hearing from others, probably in decades, that we actually looked at issues impacting the justice system here in Michigan. Our system is very decentralized. The benefits of that, which extends to diversion, is that local communities can be innovative and create and partnerships and establish programming based on the needs that they're seeing and hearing from young people in their communities. The downside is that there has historically been a lack of standards in how young people come into the system, how they're treated when they're in it, the resources they are available to them when they participate or involved with court supervision, the use of detention, so on and so forth, can really vary county to county. We like to call it justice by geography. And so the goal of the task force really was to try to look at where the most glaring issues are, the most glaring disparities are, and have a conversation about where statewide standards could be put into place and best practices. And so I won't go into all of the recommendations that came out of that task force, which was comprised of policymakers, justice stakeholders, judges, prosecutors, so forth, advocates like myself, young people who have had lived experience, and parents as well. But there were 32 recommendations at all. Overwhelmingly, they were voted in support unanimously. And so for diversion, those recommendations covered a range of things. For example, it changed the state funding mechanism, which is called the Child Care Fund, is managed by our Department of Health and Human Services, to one, increase the reimbursement rate that counties get for offering community-based care to children. And this includes kids who are on probation and adjudicated as well. But also allows diversion to be covered in a larger way too, at a higher rate, reimbursing counties than detention or out-of-home care. And so it really incentivizes the expansion and use of community-based options and using diversion as well. And of the reforms that passed, that were recommended in this final report and then were ultimately passed in the legislature and signed into law last December, that funding change, I saw just glancing at the questions about state funding came up. Like that was really the linchpin and for all of the reforms. It allowed, for example, us to eliminate most juvenile court fines and fees here, which was a huge problem. Being able to answer the question of where that additional revenue will come from, well, it'll be from the savings, hopefully, that local jurisdictions and the state will see by having more kids served in community-based options or diversion programs instead of expensive detention and residential care. So that state funding piece really was the linchpin reform that allowed for other pieces of the reform package to be included in and supported as well. For my second link, I am going to share a link to an overview that we have on our website of all of the legislation. It breaks down the public acts, and you can see that there's a box specific for diversion. Some of the reforms that were included in the legislation that passed last fall included, again, allowing diversion to be covered at a higher rate through state funding, but also allowing for pre-arrest diversion to be covered through state funding here in Michigan. For the most part, historically, a local jurisdiction could not be reimbursed for their services. And the way it works is that counties pay for the costs of most juvenile justice services in-home and out up front, and the state reimburses them back 50%. The change makes community-based care 75%. They were only eligible for reimbursement for diversion after a petition has already been filed with the court, which creates a delay in services, a delay in treatment options. It just creates an additional barrier for kids to get access to services, and it puts them in front of the court. Even though it's meant to be an informal process, it still allows the court to even at a light touch, have a touch with young people in the justice system. The change would allow for young people to be diverted at the pre-arrest level. So if schools, a parent, local law enforcement are seeing that a young person is in need of treatment options or services before coming in contact with the court, they can now access many of the same programs that kids receive on probation without having a formal petition filed with the court, which is so huge. I mean, we've heard so many parents in the past talk about how they're just encouraged to get their kid involved with the justice system just to receive the services that they need. So now they can access that without formal court involvement. It created standards and time length for a young person to be on diversion. So right now, a young person can be referred from the court to a diversion program and stay on that program for 3 months, 6 months, a year. I've seen 2 years in some situations. Now to try to align with best practices, again, with this being a light touch while still referring young people to treatment options, the maximum time a young person can be in a diversion program will be 90 days, with exceptions if there's a need for treatment to go beyond that. There's a requirement that all young people will be screened with a validated risk tool to help with decision making, and receive a mental health screening too when diverted. Another piece that I think was highlighted with Jessica's presentation and was an issue with fines and fees is that we were seeing a lot of disparities in who was being eligible or referred to diversion based on if they owed any money to the court or the victim or not. One of the policy changes that was included in the bills that were signed into law last December would no longer allow for a young person to be refused diversion or ineligible for diversion simply by owing restitution. There'll still be mechanisms to repair that harm and address those costs, but if a child is eligible for diversion, they can now receive it. And then the final piece I'd like to add with that is that historically, young people were only eligible for a diversion if they did not commit an assaultive offense. So any kind of assaultive crime, which can be, misdemeanor assault, felony assault, etc., wasn't eligible for diversion. The goal of this change, of the changes, both for diversion but also broadly here, was to really focus on a young person's risk and their needs, and not the offense that they committed. So the law change shifted that ineligibility clause from assaultive crimes generally to more the specified juvenile offenses that prosecutors can waive a young person to the adult system for, which are your more serious offenses and are unlikely to receive diversion. I would say too that one of the key components in being successful in passing this legislation and the other pieces of the reforms that were included too was that it was brought on by a task force of the various stakeholders. So when it came time to talk to legislators about advancing these bills, we got support from judges, probation office, the prosecutors who believed that we needed to expand diversion to keep kids out of the system who don't need to be, and also utilize resources better for those who require it. And it was the courts who really argued for that piece around changing the rules around assaultive crimes, arguing that, hey, there are kids who get into school fights who we can address that problem, resolve the conflict, and get them services without formal court involvement. So having that voice even argue for those reforms were a huge thing. So I'll stop there. Happy to answer any questions about the reforms here in Michigan, but we really view them as foundational but transformational to be able to do more.
Thanks so much, Jason. I had mentioned earlier, that we're not really able to get to all of your questions, and those of you who have your hands raised, please type the questions into the chat, but don't hesitate to reach out to me afterwards, and I'll see if we can direct your question and answer it. In particular, if you're doing work in your states, the kind of things that Jason was talking about, please let me know. The Sentencing Project would like to be part of advocacy campaigns to change these things. Jessica and Dick, can you come on camera again? I'm curious, Jason, to know, when you talk about the task force and the advocacy efforts, to what extent were directly impacted people part of that conversation? I saw a vibrant conversation in the chat about the four of us are not, I think, directly impacted people, but to what extent do they impact the work that you've done? Actually,
So
I don't know.
there were several people, again, young people and parents who served on the task force, and everyone. I would, give a shout out to the Council for State Governments who served as the facilitator of this process. They did an excellent job in presenting data, explaining things in simple terms so that everyone could access the information being discussed and really be a part of the policy discussions. In addition to that, they hosted several listening sessions with young people and families to talk about how their experience in the justice system impacted them while they're in it, and in the struggle, any kind of struggles going out of it, the good and the bad. And I think that the folks that they invited to participate and the audience that heard that was the various stakeholder members and people who weren't on the task force as well. I think that they did an excellent job supporting those folks and prepping them to speak so that they could not just doom and gloom, but actually provide solid recommendations on how to reform the system. And I think that that went a long way to impacting some pretty significant reforms here.
Thanks. And Jessica, we're getting a lot of questions. I'm folding things together here, but sort of about operations, including how your program is funded, and if someone wanted to replicate what Sentinel was doing in their own communities, what sort of lessons would you have for replication, including how to pay for all of this?
Yeah, so some key lessons around funding is the states, a lot of our states have JJCPA funds, Juvenile Justice Crime Prevention Act, and Title II funds that come through the feds and get distributed through the states, can be used around quote, juvenile justice crime prevention work. And so that's one source of funds. And we've also in California, there's other sources of funding. Another one is Dispute Resolution Program Act in California. I don't know if I've heard there's similar things in other states, which takes a portion of court filing fees and puts them towards funds for counties to fund alternatives to the court system. And so that's been another long-going 30-year source of funding. And then another key piece is really pulling together multiple stakeholders from the system, those with lived experience, those that are heading up these systems that are perpetuating these inequities. And we have found judges to be great partners to bring about convenings And so that is how our tiny little community-led organization that is made up of folks who mainly, most of us have been either personally touched by the system or our family members have. And that's how we got so much influence within the system. At the time when we started this, we were 12 staff, and we worked with judges to convene system leads, and we brought civil rights attorneys and folks with lived experience to come to consensus on how to move forward. And that was really helpful.
Excellent. So we only have a couple of minutes left, and I think I'd love to hear from you about like the lessons learned in this work at a time that is difficult for advocates for our youth. We really see youth being disproportionately blamed for what's happening. A lot of people are afraid of crime. To what extent is diversion an answer for some of those challenges? So I'll let each of you get a last word in on that question, and then we'll thank our audience for their time. Dick, why don't you start, and then we'll go to Jason and then Jessica.
I think that diversion addresses your question in two ways. One is that we know that young people will commit less future crime if they're diverted. So if you really want to keep the community safe, you need to divert the kids who will do better through diversion. And the other is that it allows the justice system to concentrate on the people who really endanger the community. Too much of our justice system resources, too much of our time and energy is focused on supervising people who are not a risk to the community. And so that's what we're trying to do, is let the justice system concentrate on the people who need it.
I mean, I'll just echo what Dick said. I mean, when we advocated for these reforms, those were the same talking points we used with the legislature. Concentrate resources on the kids who need it, keep kids who can get their needs met outside, whether it's through their school, the community services in their community, to get access that way. And it's going to take communities to push their local stakeholders to really invest in diversion programs. Passing laws is great, having the funding available to do it is awesome too, but it's going to take all of us to make sure that it actually happens and that we keep the momentum going.
Yeah, and if our concern is we want less crime, our communities really need to look beyond, I want harsher penalties to achieve less crime. They need to look at, are we actually achieving that, and hold our courts accountable. And I think if we look seriously at the outcomes that our courts are getting, we can see that the harsher penalties and court processing is not leading to less crime. And so if we get real about the data and hold all parts of the system accountable for actually achieving less crime and look at that, we're going to get to some smarter solutions, because diversion is leading to less crime.
I think that's absolutely true. And I hope that that's the big takeaway that people have from this conversation, is understanding that what some people may say is a soft or lenient approach is actually a more effective approach. I get very frustrated with the idea of certain policies being called tough on crime when they create more of it. And we heard from Jay, we heard from Jessica, we heard from Jason, and we heard from the research that Dick has summarized, that these have better outcomes, that we really have better outcomes for our kids, and that we can support these programs and support our communities by the use of diversion. So I really hope that this will be part of an ongoing conversation. I dropped my email into the chat, but if you're doing work in your state legislatures on this stuff, that's something the Sentencing Project would love to know more about. So please don't hesitate to be in contact with me. Thank you all.